Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, wherever you are. We hope you, your families, and colleagues are very well at this time. Thanks for attending this panel, Measuring Trust in Institutions Matters, here at the United Nations World Data Forum 2021. My name is Adrian Franco. I am Vice President of the National Institute for Statistics and Geography, INEGI, in Mexico City, in Mexico, and I have the honor to moderate this session. Before starting, some basic questions to our audience. Do you trust in your national government, in your local police, in politicians, in your health national system? Do you trust in your colleagues? What about your relatives or your neighbors? Do you trust in social platforms, for example? Or do you trust in your official statistics in your country? This is important questions. And when we talk about trust, to define trust is very complicated. We feel trust, but to define is very complicated. It's a wide and huge concept related to many things. However, we know that trust is one of the most important assets for human beings, for organizations, private organizations and public organizations. Of course, it is so important. Trust is so important to governments and public institutions. Because of the relevance of the concept of trust and the idea of trust, trust has become one of the very important topics to measure and analyze. Just two examples. First, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has developed several works related to measuring trust. Just to mention some of these works, for example, the policy framework to understand drivers on trust in institutions, the OECD Trust Survey, trust and its determinants that is as a result of the Trust Lab experience, the module of trust in the document Government at a Glance, the OECD Guidelines on Measuring Trust, and many others. Other important example of the relevance of trust is that trust in public institutions is part of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal, indicator 16.7.2. This because, well, the name of this indicator is inclusive and responsive decision making. This is part of this because if you consider that high levels of political efficacy are correlated with trust in government, perceptions of legitimacy of public institutions, higher levels of political participation, and it is related to life of people or satisfaction with life in the people. So this is all of these components are part of the trust in public institutions, and is part of this measuring. Of course, this session is about several experience of in using statistical methods to collect and produce data related to trust in institutions. It is also related to data on trust in institutions itself. So we intend to provide a comprehensive and reliable dimension or data to dimension the phenomenon of trust and at a global and national perspective, considering the experiences from OECD, Norway, and Mexico. For analyzing this topic, we have today a great panel with three experts: Marta Lonzaga, Santiago Gonzalez, and Oscar Jaimes. Our panelists will help us to identify innovations in measuring trust, and also the importance of data on trust in order to know how these cross different levels of government, public services, and from different angles to analyze this. Well, we are going to start with the first speaker. Our first speaker is Santiago Gonzalez. Santiago is a policy analyst at the Governance Indicators and Performance Measurement Division within the OECD Public Governance Directorate. Santiago led the creation of the OECD Trust Dataset and question modules on the drivers of institutional trust put forward by OECD Guidelines on Measuring Trust, the Trust Lab initiative, and selected by a European Social Survey to be included in the panel, in their panel survey Kronos 2. All these are measuring related to trust in Europe. His the main research of Santiago, the areas are public governance indicators, trust in public institutions, political efficacy, drivers of satisfaction with services, and the relationship between good governance and people's well-being. Santiago is going to talk about measuring the title of the presentation is measuring the determinants of public trust in institutions. Santiago, you are very welcome. The floor is yours.
So thanks a lot, Adrian. It is my pleasure to be here, and thanks a lot to the UN World Data Forum and to INEGI for organizing this session. Let me share my screen, and I will tell you a little bit about the work we are doing in the OECD about the trust measurement. So, are you able to see my screen? Perfect. So well, this is the outline of my presentation. So let me just start by giving you what is our working definition of trust. As Adrian said, this is a very complex, multidimensional topic. So basically, we define trust, as a person believes that another person or institution will act consistently with his or her expectation of positive behavior. Here I would like to emphasize two aspects. First, the one that we are referring to expectation, positive expectation, and expectation of a positive behavior from a third party. And therefore, it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about the trustworthiness of public institutions. But why do we care about trust? Adrian already said many elements. I think it's key to the legitimacy and stability of political system. There is, of course, the social contract through which people delegate trust, power to the institutions, and this is basically based in public trust on the fact that there is trust in the fact that they will use this power correctly and that they will use it for the good of people. It is also important because it helps government to govern without necessarily restoring to coercion. So basically, it also has effects on citizen compliance and participation in policy. We have seen a lot of this during the COVID crisis. In countries where levels of trust were high, there has been much more compliance with restrictive measures or measures that were required to cope with the pandemic. And there is a new wave of research showing that also trust is important as it mediates support for long-term policies. This is that societies where levels of trust are high are those where also people is willing to support policies that aim at, for instance, tackling climate change or keeping debt at sustainable levels. So it's a very important, if we could say, fuel that also would allow for the sustainability of the system in the future. And of course, we always talk in public governance as trust as an outcome or as the outcome of good public governance. So when institutions perform well, there is public trust. So let me see. Okay. So let me show you a little bit of the data. So trust indicators have been produced, and I think since at least the early 2000s by many, let's say, official, but also many non-official data providers. This is data from the Gallup World Poll, and it shows trust in 2020, and it's changed since 2007. And here we have to be a little bit cautious, because the data for 2020 is mainly collected during the COVID, so there might be some effects of the pandemic. But basically what we see is that there is, on average in 2020, trust in OECD countries was about 50%, but there is wide variation across countries. For instance, if you take a country such as Chile, it's less than 15%. In a country such as Switzerland or Norway, it's close or above 80%. So there is wide variation across countries. And also there has been important variation over time. But it becomes more complicated as we know that this notion of when we ask people about trust in government, it's a very, if we could say it this way, a very loaded metric. In the sense that, of course, it is sending some signals about what is happening in a society, but it could be influenced by many things. And when we look at trust measures of different institutions, we also see that there is a lot of variation across the different institutions. For instance, here we have some data from the presented in Government at a Glance, but it's from the World Values Survey or the European Values Study. And we see that the police, at least in most countries, tends to be one of the most trusted institutions. Then it's followed by the civil service. And then you find below this, the government and the parliament. Of course, this varies across country, but here we start perceiving that there is some sort of two factors, if we could call one that is more administrative and one that is more political in a way. And that even within those, there are different levels of trust across institutions. And this is a figure of trust during COVID. And this is why I mentioned that the 2020 data should be seen a little bit with some, let's say, take it with an inch of salt, because what we have seen and what is known in the trust literature as the rallying around the flag effect. So basically, it's this idea that when there is a crisis, that is a major crisis, that it is a major shock, such as the COVID pandemic, people gather and rally behind its institutions. And we see here that levels of trust in these countries that we are showing here, but it also happened in most OECD countries, increase in the early stages of the pandemic. People who needed governments to work, if we could say in this way. They were behind their institutions. However, as time passed, it came down again. And what would be the aftermath of this crisis in terms of trust is a question that remains open, and it will very much depend on basically the type of measures that are taken and how the recovery will look like once it finally arrives. So it's an open question. Trust, of course, it's a volatile, it's influenced by this type of episodes, but we also have seen in other cases that there are also some upwards or downward trends that could be persistent. And in these cases, it will become a little bit more problematic. So as part of the things that we have done is that we started basically compiling all existing measures of institutional trust. We put together a data set that is called the OECD Trust Dataset that cover basically 124 countries and has trust measures from 2002 to 2015. And we did a very rigorous statistical analysis of the accuracy of these measures. What we found is that, and in terms of when I say accuracy, I mean for those of you that are statisticians in terms of reliability and validity, basically we found that existing trust measures perform very well in terms of reliability. So there was consistency across different trust metrics as collected by different instruments, but they were also performing well in terms of construct validity. So they were behaving more or less as we expected, according to theory, but there were problems in terms of phase validity and convergent validity that either we couldn't test or that were not performing as we expected. So we concluded, and it's in the OECD Trust Guidelines, that some of these measures actually tend to underperform and should be considered as experimental. But then, basically the question that was more relevant to us, or that we also start wondering about, was, of course, we know that these trust metrics are an important signal. They are telling us something. They have the capacity to call public attention, to trigger government response. But what is driving this trust in public institutions? What is behind this trust in public institutions? And when you go to the literature, you find many theories. Of course, there is this theory that says that this is about culture and social capital. Other that is about the economic cycle and punctual economic events. But there is one that says that actually, and where there is robust body of evidence, that trust is also influenced by the performance of institutions. So how well institutions are actually performing, how well are public servants or people working in government behaving. And therefore, we started digging in this literature, and we constructed a framework that basically recognizes that there are two main determinants of public trust. One is trust in competence, or the ability of governments to deliver at the level that citizens speak. And the other one is what we call trust in values, or basically is the fact that governments act with integrity, with openness, and with fairness. So basically what I am showing here is what we call our OECD framework on the drivers of public trust that have these two core components, competence and values. Within each of them, our 5 policy dimensions: responsiveness relates directly to provision of public services, reliability to government capacity to anticipate and assess evolving challenges, to have some sort of predictability, but also to be forward-looking, integrity, of course, I mean, acting without corruption, if we could say this way, and according to ethical standards, openness to share information and to engage citizens in decision, and fairness, well, on the one hand, treating everybody fairly, but also having this notion of the common good in mind. We also have other determinants, as, for instance, political efficacy, evaluation of key government policies on long-term issues, and so on and so forth. So, but the most important for us are these 5 determinants of public trust. So what we have done in the OECD is, of course, we had this theoretical framework that we founded in the literature, and we are now moving to the measurement of all of this. And we are advancing with what we have called the OECD Trust Survey. And this survey is a way of instrumentalizing or actually putting measurement to this framework. We have done this, I mean, we are not starting from scratch. Again, as I mentioned, there is the OECD Trust Guidelines that already were including some of these questionnaires. We have done several country case studies. So we did a first one with Korea, in which we implemented the first version of our survey. Then we did one with Finland, in which the survey was actually fielded by the National Statistical Office. And now we are working with our friends from Norway, from DFO, so Marte's institution, in a similar study for Norway. So basically, this is the structure of our, and now, as I mentioned, we are fielding this survey in 20 OECD countries. And in the case of one of these countries is Mexico. And in this case, we are working with our friends from INEGI who are implementing directly the questionnaire. This survey is governed by a board or by a steering group of countries that comprises representatives to our public governance committee, but also from national statistical offices, as for instance, Adrian and Oscar. So this is the structure of our survey. It has, of course, questions on the levels of trust, but then again, not just trust in government, but trust in several institutions, political, administrative, law and order institution. It has questions on the drivers of public trust. And here we have a very specific way of asking this question, because we are, of course, and then I go back to the initial definition about this expectation of positive behavior by public institutions. So we have specific situations in which people are expected to interact with those institutions, and whether or not they expect, how do they expect that they will behave. And then we have, again, other control questions on political efficacy, satisfaction with services, and as in every survey, background questions on gender, age, region, income, and so on and so forth. So let me show you just a couple of results. This is not from the survey that we are, let's say, will be fielding from November, but for some of the, let's say, piloting and testing that we have done through the case studies and through the Trust Lab initiative. That was also when we started testing this questionnaire. So this is basically a statistic of the percentage of the population in these 6 OECD countries that believe their government is either responsible, reliable, open, honest, and fair. As you see, there is a variation across dimensions, but also across countries. If, for instance, you take a country such as Finland, of course, they score very high in terms of reliability and fairness, but not a little bit, and are the top performance in almost all of the dimensions, with the exception of openness. And then, if, for instance, you take a question of a country such as Italy, you will see that the picture is a little bit different. And the most important, where trust, let's say, where they think that the government is actually less integral, so that there is perceived lack of integrity. So there is variation across the countries and across the dimension in the different countries. And this one is an example from the case study we have done in Finland. That is the application of our framework, 2 levels of trust. This is trust in 3 different institutions: trust in government, trust in the local government, trust in the civil service. What we see is that there is a trust payoff from increasing both competence and values. So the dimensions of the framework I described before. However, there is variation across the relative importance of these policy dimensions for each of the institutions. If we are talking about trust in government, the most important is the government competence. So in a way, it refers to the capacity to adapt public services and also to the preparedness of government to cope with crises and challenges. If we are talking about trust in the local government, we see that the picture it's much more mixed, and here aspects of values become much more relevant. And when I talk about values, it refers mainly to aspects such as openness and engagement with the community, capacity to participate in public decision making and having access to information. And then again, for trust in the civil service, again, there is they are both important, but there are different aspects that influence this. So all of this to say that we see that, of course, the framework is actually telling us that that there could be increases on trust levels by improving these determinants, but that these determinants vary across institutions, and therefore we need more, say, focalized or focused strategies in each of these to address different levels of trust in different institutions. So just, I don't know how I am going to conclude. Basically, so we know, we know and we have witnessed with the COVID pandemic that trust is a key metric that is basically assessing the country, social and economic state. I always like to think about the metrics of trust in government as some sort of metrics of the, let's say, the state of mind of a society to a certain extent, in what relates public affairs. So they send important signals. They are, at the moment, very, very research. We need to understand them better. We are working on that. This is why we are launching this survey in 20 OECD countries. We have reviewed our framework in view of the COVID pandemic. So what I showed you already is kind of an extended version of the framework. Some takeaways is that our survey, goes beyond kind of traditional trust metrics. That is a mix of perception, evaluation, and experience question. And of course, it allows not looking at the average, but at all the disaggregations by different groups. And I think for us, the long-term objective is to actually being able to monitor this data over time and basically have data on the level, but also on the driver of trust with certain regularity, with high quality standards, and have a better evidence base to monitor and to understand trust and its determinants. So with this, I conclude. These are all reference to our work in the field of public trust. And we remain open to the discussion and to all the questions you may have. And thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Santiago. Thank you very much for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation related to the work done by OECD, which is very important. As you said, it covers a lot of countries, and we will wrap up at the end with together with the other experience from Norway and Mexico. Thank you very much, Santiago. And now let's move to our next panelist. She is Marte Lonzaga. Marte holds a master's degree in political science and works as advisor and data and analyst in the Agency for Public and Financial Management in Norway. She is employed in the Division for Governance, Organization, and Leadership, and is part of the team that conducts the National Citizen Survey every 2 years. Ms. Saga also coordinates the joint efforts with the OECD to measure trust and drivers of trust among citizens in this year's survey in Norway. Marte, the title of the presentation of Marte is Measuring the Determinants of Public Trust in Institutions. Marte, you are very welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share the screen. I hope you see it now. Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about providing good quality services. And I see from Santiago's presentation that there's already something mentioned about this, but I will try to mention some other important things as well. Thank you very much for having me speak in such an interesting session, and thank you to OECD who took us through a very interesting presentation, I think. I'll just go ahead. So the Citizen Survey was conducted in Norway for the first time in 2010. The Ministry of Local Government and Modernization decided that they wanted to conduct a survey among the citizens that captured different aspects of living in Norway. And this was, one of the reasons for this was sort of a shift towards becoming, or the government becoming more user-oriented or customer-oriented, and wanting to provide better quality public services and see sort of the citizen as sort of a customer of public service. And in order to measure the satisfaction and monitor the satisfaction, which is an important basis for being able to improve them, this survey was conducted. Then you see in the timeline that we've had some developments. The goal has always been to increase the knowledge on what works well and what areas of the Norwegian society and public sector has room for improvement still. And in 2017, we started including some questions on trust and both interpersonal trust and mainly trust in politicians. So trust in parliamentarians and local government politicians. And then in 2021, this year, we revised the survey, started working with OECD, and now we measure trust comprehensively, way more comprehensively than we have done before. And we measure different aspects, the drivers of trust that Santiago mentioned in his presentation. This year, we sent the survey out to 40,000 citizens, and we had a response rate of almost 25%, so 9,900 respondents, which is an okay response rate considering the developments that a lot of surveys are now getting less and less response rates. But yeah, the areas that the citizen survey covers are these: local community and possibilities in the municipality, living in Norway, interpersonal trust and trust in institutions, and drivers of trust. The two yellow ones are the ones we have coordinated with the OECD to measure. We measure attitudes towards public sector, experience and satisfaction with public services, overall well-being, and democratic participation and political efficacy. So as you see, this is a broad survey measuring a wide area of, or a wide range of areas. And in addition to this, also a lot of background variables. So trust in Norway. Norway is often called a high trust society. This is true at least compared to many other OECD countries. both for trust in institutions and interpersonal trust. And in the graph you can see on my slide, you see that Norway have the highest, second highest level of trust in government. This is trust in government, doesn't say, but it is, from a poll in 2020. But why is this interesting? Why should we care about measuring trust? Santiago mentioned a lot of interesting reasons that we, of course, completely agreed with. Trust is to an increasing degree pointed out as one of the most important factors in how successful a society can manage a crisis, which was very evident in Norway during the pandemic. It was not only the citizens, important that the citizens trusted the government to enforce sort of the right restrictions at the right time, but also the citizens had to have high trust levels amongst each other to follow these restrictions enforced by the government. Otherwise, it would fall apart. And although not shown here, the interpersonal trust usually scores fairly high in Norway as well. A lot of the times even higher than trust in institutions. But it's not only important in a crisis, it's also in the everyday functioning of society and the legitimacy of the political system that Santiago pointed to earlier. But why is satisfaction with public services important? As mentioned, this was the original sort of rationale between the survey, or behind the survey. And just for context, so Norway has one of the highest proportions of citizens employed in the public sector among all OECD countries. And in addition to this, Norwegian citizens pay fairly high tax rates compared to a lot of other countries. We have a comprehensive welfare state and a lot of services that citizens need in the course of a lifetime are public services. So therefore we need, or imagine that you are a citizen and you pay, let's say, 45 to 50% of your income tax, and you are not happy at all with the services that you get in return. This would be a major sort of democratic legitimacy problem. So therefore we have to have an idea of how these services perform among the citizens and to monitor this over time. This graph shows it's the selection of some of the services that are public and that we measure. These are just some of the state level services. We also have a variety of municipal level services. And as you can see, it looks like a lot of the services are showing sort of a upward trend, not very strong, but the most striking thing is perhaps the stability over time. But a paradox is that if you look at the bars all the way to the left, which is all services, it looks like citizens are becoming less happy with the services. But when you look at all the individual ones and how they score, it looks like they're actually performing better over time, that people are becoming more satisfied. And I also want to mention that we ask respondents as well whether they have personal experience with the service or not. So this lets us look at the differences between experiences and perception. And the trend is usually if people have experience with the public service, they are more satisfied with that service on average, which is interesting. Now back to trust and some advantages of measuring trust and satisfaction with public services in the same survey. We wanted to include the OECD questions of trust in our survey because when we know that trust is such an important factor in the functioning of society and the political system, we want to understand more about it. So here I'm aiming at what Santiago calls the drivers of trust. And there are some advantages to adding these questions to a survey like ours. that primarily focuses on the attitudes towards public service. First, you could say that it gives us the possibility to observe how attitudes and experiences across different fields relate to each other within the same sample and relate to trust. So instead of having a trust survey and a public services survey, we can actually look at the same sample and compare the two within the same sample. The other thing is that we can monitor changes over time to see how they correspond. And I'm going to show you some examples later, just in a second. The only disadvantage I could find was that the survey now is perhaps too comprehensive. We've gotten some comments on the survey that it was too long and it takes a lot for respondents to sit through long surveys. The first example I want to draw attention to is the police, because first of all, actually, I would like to stress the fact that I am now going to give some examples that focus on preliminary results from the Citizen Survey 2021. So we are very excited for OECD to finish their report on the Norwegian, the trust in the Norwegian society, but right now I will give some examples from the preliminary results, but don't arrest me for doing this later. I would just like to draw some attention to the fact that the police is very highly trusted in Norway, as you could see, as an institution. And it's only surpassed by the courts and legal system. But if you remember from 2 slides back, we also regard the police as a service. And we can see that it looks like people are becoming slightly more satisfied with the police. If we had numbers on trust from earlier, we might be able to say something about the correlation between them. We haven't done that, but as we keep doing the survey, we will perhaps get more numbers on this to see later. And an important thing is that for the people who have experience with the police and for the people who rate the police based on their perception, there also seems to be a difference. Obviously, not a lot of people have had experience with the police, but if you do not have experience, it looks like the satisfaction with the police and the trust in the police are very highly correlated. While if you do have experience with the police, trust doesn't matter that much for how you rate it. So this gives us an indication that that trust matters when you are answering questions based on your perception. Another example I would like to give is one of regional differences. So the urban versus rural areas matters. And in Norway, we see clear trends that the people who live in more rural areas and far away from the capital are less happy with public services, both state-level public services and municipal services. They also trust the public institutions to a lesser degree, which is an interesting correlation and could be the basis of several interesting questions to further investigate. This is, I think, what Santiago maybe was pointing to as trust in competence. It looks like when people trust the government and the public service to be competent in service provision, this also correlates highly with having high levels of trust. And of course, on the basis of these preliminary results, I can't say anything about the direction of the correlation or whether it's we are talking about causation. But we are excited to keep measuring trust and using the OECD framework, because at least it looks like there is a relationship between the provision of good quality public services and the levels of trust. Thank you very much.
Marte, thank you very much for showing us the results of preliminary results of your survey. It's very important the different dimensions that you are collecting in the data of in this survey. And of course, as you said, the more oriented is a government related to a focus on citizen-oriented or results-oriented, the most important is to measure the trust and satisfaction with public services. So it's very important. Congratulations for your survey. And we will go back to some questions later in some minutes. Now, thank you, Marte. Now let's move to our third panelist. He's Oscar Jaimes. Oscar is the General Director for Governance, Crime and Justice Statistics at the National Institute for Statistics and Geography of Mexico. Previous to this position, Oscar also served in several positions in the federal government in issues related to tackling corruption, health services, planning, and the structure of indicators. Since 2009, he works for the National Institute of Statistics and Geography. Oscar holds a PhD in social and political science from the Ibero-American University in Mexico City. The title of the presentation of Oscar is Measuring Trust in Mexico, a comprehensive approach through households and business surveys. Oscar, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adrian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you confirm it?
Yeah. Presentation is good. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you, Adrian, for having me at this panel. The title of my presentation is on the screen, and I will share with you some of the experience that the National Statistical Office in Mexico, INEGI, has in measuring trust in several domains. And I will start by giving you some info about the several surveys in which we include the measuring of trust. First, the National Survey on Governmental Quality and Impact, which is targeted to population 18 and over. It's with a sample size of 46,000 households. It's biennial since 2011. The last edition was in 2019. A similar, quite similar survey on the design is ENCRIGE. It's a national survey of regulatory quality and government impact for enterprises. And this is for economic units, private sector economic units, with a sample size of more than 34,000 economic units. The last edition was in 2020. We recently made another survey, which is the National Survey of Civic Culture, and its focus is on democratic values and civic culture, targeted to population age 15 and over. The sample size was 25,000 households, and it was conducted in the third quarter of 2020. And the National Survey of Access to Public Information and Protection of Personal Data, targeted to population age 18 and over, with a sample size of more than 17,000 households. There has been two editions for this one, 2016 and 2019. Well, now some of the results. I should say that, as you can see, we have several surveys, not just one, in which we measure and we try to have a comprehensive approach on the measuring of trust. This is from the Civic Culture Survey, which was in 2020. And here we can see on the screen the population age 15 and over according to the degree of trust in people and some authorities. So first we have for most people, which is one of the recommendations from the OECD on their guidelines. So we used the scale from 0 to 10, and the average for most people, the trust in most people is 5.4 in the scale from 0 to 10. We added 2 questions to have another view on trust on people. Most people you know personally, the average was 7.4, and most people living in their neighborhood or local community, the average was similar to most people with 5.8. And for public servants or government employees, it turned out to have an average of 4.2, less than most people. We disaggregate this by sex, and there is mainly no difference. It's quite similar for the results, the estimates for women and for men on these categories. We, in this survey, also included trust in several institutions and sectors. And here it's important to notice that we used a Likert scale. And what I'm showing in this graph is the estimates for how much, the question is how much trust do you have on the following institutions? And what is showing is much trust or some trust. So it's the people that have some or much trust in these institutions. The Army and the Navy are the most trusted institutions, followed by the National Guard and the National Electoral Institute. At the bottom, we find the local deputies, Congress, and the police. And we disaggregate this by sex and by age range. Now about the drivers of trust in institutions, still on the civic culture survey, we have a couple of questions. The first one is about how people considers, or the government, per se, the government considers the opinion of people for decision making. This was 2020. The total, for the total population, the result was 65% that agreed with this statement. Is slightly higher for men than for women, and for the youngest, on the age range of 15 to 17, is higher. The other question is about the belief of having the knowledge and skills to participate in political activities such as voting, attending demonstrations or protests, etc. And the result was 69% of the population that believes that have the skills to participate in political activities. For men is higher with 71% than for women with 68%. And for age range, the highest were for the 20 to 29 years. There are no difference between rural and urban domain. And now on other dimension about personal data, about the concern to share personal data. First, we have that 96% of the population provided personal data to public institutions or private companies. And that is on the left, and on the right, we find the estimates about the concern. There is a high concern about the misuse of data, more than 80% for account number or bank card, personal phone, address, and some other personal data shared with public and private companies. 48% of the population in Mexico believes that it's easy to access to public information produced by the government, 48% at the national level, and we disaggregate this by state level and by sex. Men have a higher perception than women, and also the youngest, from 18 to 29 years. Now, what I'm showing in this slide is the trust in different institutions and sectors. This is for 2019. This comes from the National Survey on Quality of Government Impact, which measures quality of services. And on the right, we have a rating provided by the respondents. And this is, of course, the estimate for the general population. For relatives is 8.1. Or then we have public universities, 7.4. We have Army and Navy, 7.1. Co-workers, 7.2. And at the bottom, we have political parties, Congress, and police officers. On the percentage, what we can observe is that men have a higher level of trust in these different institutions and sectors, with the exceptions of religion institutions in which women have a higher trust. This is the same, but for economic units. So we have public universities, public schools, employees of the establishment, and business people linked to the establishment on the first, with the highest percentages, trust. And on the bottom, we have unions, political parties, police officers, prosecutors, Congress, judges, and state governments with around 50 or less percentage. That's population that have trust, by much or some trust. This is economic units. Now, satisfaction with public services. We have an approach in which we first have a screening to determine the population that is user of these public services. On the left, we have basic public education. On the right, we have the main healthcare provider in Mexico. So we have then a framing that is several characteristics related to the quality of the public service. For education, we ask about school day compliance, syllabuses, teachers that can be trusted for their ability, teaching staff is enough or sufficient. And for healthcare, for instance, we have care without providing additional materials, clean and orderly facilities, respectful treatment, timely and understandable information, doctors that can be trusted for their abilities, etc. And so after that framing, we have the questions about the general satisfaction. So for basic public education was 68%, and for the main healthcare provider was 44%. Now, this is for economic units. 20% of the economic units in 2016 believed that regulatory framework was an obstacle for economic units, and this had an increase in 2020, in which was 28% of economic units. We have disaggregation by size and by sector. Now, about the treatment received when carrying out formalities for population, we have the series that has been stable around 78 to 79% along the series. That's on the left. On the right, we have the disaggregation by type of formality. 84% of the economic units were satisfied with the treatment received when carrying out formalities in 2020. We have a disaggregation by state. And on the right, we can see that we also have a disaggregation by type of formality, which is quite important for public policy purposes. That would be all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for showing us the different methods and instruments and statistical programs that we have in Mexico in order to collect data related to trust in public services and different institutions and interpersonal. Thank you very much for our the presentations from our three speakers. Now we have some minutes in order to coordinate a question and answers section. And if you trust me, what I will do is to keep some questions from the Q&A section from the HUA that we have already some, and some very, very specific questions to our presenters, to our speakers. Well, I will try to wrap up some of the questions and comments from the Q&A section. About sharing methods, of course, OECD has extensive literature in the webpage, and you can find also from other experts where we can find these methodologies in order to measuring trust. What aspects of institutional trust matter the most? As we saw in the presentation, of course, there is no plain response to this. It depends on the country, depends on the culture. In some countries, there is much more value to public services. In other, to trust or to reputation or confidence to the political institutions, for example. So that's important, and this is important to measure trust. Culture and leadership, of course, they are related, and they impact on trust and in different ways. So, and there are a specific question to Oscar from the Q&A in the HUA, and it is related, Oscar, to the data that you show, in which women trust less to institutions than men. Can you elaborate very quick on this? What is the difference between men and women when we talk about trust in institutions, Oscar? In just 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. I didn't mention that we started measuring trust in victimization surveys, which have recommendations from the UNODC Manual for Victimization Surveys. We included a question on trust and also about fear about crime. And I think this is important to mention now because women, along the series that we have since 2011, has shown that women have higher level of fear to crime. And it's also associated to trust or to the perception about the police specifically, and also the criminal justice system. So I think this is important to notice because there is a strong correlation in this. And even though we don't have this kind of analysis in the trust questions for other surveys, this is quite informative about the fear and the perceptions about the police and the criminal justice systems that correlates. Women have less confidence on the police than men and higher fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. A question for Marte, because in Norway, as we saw, there is a very, very important focus on public service satisfaction. Marte, I will combine two questions. Do you think it is possible to recover the trust when people lost trust in public services? And the second part is, do you think it is a relationship between trust and the satisfaction with public services, Marte?
I want to start with the last question first. So I think, as Santiago also mentioned, the responsiveness dimension of the drivers of trust have been shown to be one of the most important ones. So so a good score on the responsiveness dimension, which is stability and good quality public service provision and a couple other indicators. This is shown to have a positive correlation with trust levels. So I definitely think it matters, but I do think we need to explore this relationship further, which is what the OECD will do in Norway in a report that will come out early next year for all of you who are interested. And to your first question, I would like to, I'm not sure. I think trust can be fragile and depend on how the government performs as a whole, how media covers government performance. A lot of the time, the media focuses on whenever things don't work or there is some kind of scandal, and that can shape the perception of public services, which in turn can shape how much you trust the government. But I think it is possible to restore to restore low levels of trust. I also just want to make one comment to what Oscar said before, because it's interesting. In Norway, women usually have higher trust in institutions than men. And I think there can be a number of reasons for that, but crime levels in Norway are very low. So if you're connected to that, that might be one of the reasons. Thank you.
Exactly, Marte. That's why this is important to measure, because we don't know exactly the drivers of trust in every society, in every region. All of them are totally different. And finally, but not less important, a very quick question to Santiago. Santiago, of course, we are coordinated with Praia Group in working with them and another institution in order to collaborate with this measurement. In 1 minute, please tell me, in the OECD perspective, the COVID crisis has generated a larger demand for measuring trust in institutions?
Yes, Adrian. Indeed, I think very well good point on the Praia Group, because we are also very supportive of this work. There is one of the dimensions of good public governance is public trust. I mean, I think that I would like to, and answering to your question, I would like to come back to something that actually Marta said, is that I think that COVID has made very evident how important is trust to handle a crisis. Not only for that, but how important it is. And especially the type of crisis we just experienced, which is a crisis that to a certain extent was unprecedented, but I mean, coming out of it depended a lot in actually changes of behavior. And the extent to which people were willing to undertake these changes was to a large extent being driven by their trust levels, the trust in institutions and their trust in others. So definitely, and for us, this has been the opportunity to revisit our framework in light of the kind of if I could say, a real-time test that was what was happening with the COVID. We did a very large consultation with academics, with practitioners through a webinar series to revisit the framework in light of this shock. And if what we see now is that the field of trust is basically booming, if I could say it, in terms of new research, new evidence being generated. And I think definitely the COVID has played an important role on that, because it has put on the spotlight its importance, and it has kind of something that many times is taken for granted. I mean, when it works, people will not notice, or when it is there. But once it was a determinant to actually facilitate coming out of the crisis, it become very evident how fragile and how important it is. So to be very brief, yes.
Thank you very much, Santiago. Well, in order to close this session on time, well, we have taken 2 or 3 minutes. I would like to say thank you to everyone in the audience, both in Hedberg in Sweden, in Swiss, and also in the platform, the HUA. Also, thanks to our panelists, Marte Lonzaga, Santiago Gonzalez, and Oscar Jaimes. The conclusions of this panel, of course, are very evident. We have to invest in measuring trust in institutions, and also it's important in order to know and also to collect data from citizens. So thank you very much to all the people in the audience and for attending this panel and for your time. We hope and we trust that you enjoy this session and the rest of the UN World Data Forum. Thank you and have a good time. See you next time. Thank you.